This is a doubly auspicious day for attorneys general, past and present. Would you join me in wishing Attorney General Holder a very happy birthday? The Attorney General reminded us of part of the story of RFK's first day here. At the 10th Street Auto Gate, the guard did ask to see his pass. Well, he said, well, I don't have one, but for heaven's sake, I'm the Attorney General. And the guard said, well, you don't get into the building without a pass unless you're J. Edgar Hoover himself. The next day he brought a pass, and with it, a thirst for excellence, rolled up shirt sleeves, constant curiosity, a black bear of a dog named Brumus, and humor. Not many days later, he came to work on the President's Day weekend and was impressed by all the cars in the garage. He soon got a note, he sent notes to all the owners, complimenting them on their devotion. He soon got a note back from Harold Reese, who was then Nick Katzenbach's deputy in the Office of Legal Counsel. It said something like, especially on Washington's birthday, I cannot tell a lie. I was parked there while Ruth Ann and I were shopping at the holiday white sales. What a different department it was then, 30,000 employees compared with 100,000 plus today. If you asked then who was the highest ranking woman in the department, people probably would have had to stop and think and then finally say, well, isn't B. Rosenberg a section chief in the criminal division? Clyde Herndon, the Attorney General's dignified driver, may have been the only non-white face often seen on the 5th floor. I'm not sure there was even one African-American lawyer in the department then. I'm sure RFK would be gratified to see how diverse the department would become and how warmly he would thank Attorney General Holder for bringing us together today. In 1961, it didn't take long for people in the department to form impressions of the new Attorney General because he soon demonstrated several kinds of strength. One example was that provided by George Chacha Chicheris, the mayor of Gary, Indiana. He had helped JFK win 70% of Gary's vote, but then was accused of income tax evasion. Would the AG approve an indictment? Old department hands waited in some suspense, and they sure smiled when they heard that he had told Lou Oberdorfer, the head of the tax division, do what you have to do. Chicheris was convicted and spent 2 years in prison. Yes, RFK was well known as a prosecutor. What's less recognized is that he also displayed strength on behalf of defendants. That was a time of rising public concern about crime in the streets. But he was determined, as he said, that this should not just be the Department of Prosecution, but truly a Department of Justice. He established the Allen Committee on Criminal Justice, created a national conference on bail reform, and sponsored the legislation that for the first time provided paid federal counsel for poor defendants. Just down the 5100 corridor, he had David Hackett and Richard Boone create the President's Committee on Juvenile Delinquency, the forerunner of the War on Poverty. He was also physically strong, but never asked more of his colleagues than of himself. On a cold February Saturday in 1963, along the B&O Canal, he took up a challenge that President Kennedy had put to Marine Corps officers to hike 50 miles in 20 hours. RFK did it in 17 icy hours, and in dress shoes at that. When Ed Guthman, my mentor, dropped out at mile 35, RFK said, "You're lucky your brother isn't President of the United States." Of course, the most historic dimension of Robert Kennedy's tenure as Attorney General concerned civil rights. Talk about strength. RFK was moved by the strength of all those who sat and rode and marched and sometimes died for their, that is, our civil rights. We are honored today to be joined by Representative John Lewis, whose life and career spans virtually the whole civil rights movement, from the sit-ins through the brutalities of the Freedom Rides, Freedom Summer, and the Selma March. He was elected to the House in 1986 and soon became what Nancy Pelosi calls the conscience of the Congress. John Seigenthaler, a giant in modern journalism, was RFK's chief aide. A Montgomery mob cracked open his skull during the Freedom Rides. Let me note the stirring interviews that he and John Lewis gave in a remarkable award-winning documentary by Stan Nelson about the Freedom Rides that's soon to be shown on HBO. Charleyne Hunter-Gault was the first African-American woman admitted to the University of Georgia. She was a valued colleague at the New York Times and has won repeated honors for her print and broadcast journalism in this country and South Africa. And John Doar, the pride of New Richmond, Wisconsin, who joined the department during the Eisenhower years, soon came to admire RFK, and for much of the 1960s, personified justice to voting registrars throughout the South. You may recall the famous photo of him on a Mississippi street facing down an angry crowd, alone. We've asked each of them to tell what they remember best about RFK, why he came to stand for civil rights, and what we have to learn from him. Let's start with Congressman Lewis.
Thank you very much, Jack. I must say that I'm honored to be here. I want to thank the Attorney General for inviting us all to be here. Mrs. Kennedy, Kathleen, and other members of the Kennedy family, and my fellow members of the panel. I think the first time that I got to really know of the work of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and I know John Doar and John Seigenthaler will have much more to say about this, was during the Freedom Ride. I believe it became the first real test in the area of civil rights. Just think, in May of 1961, black people and white people couldn't board a Greyhound bus or a Trailway bus and leave Washington, D.C. and be seated together and travel through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, into New Orleans without the possibility of being arrested or jailed or beaten. And that's what happened. We were testing a decision of the United States Supreme Court. 13 of us, 7 whites and 6 African Americans, traveling on Trailway and Greyhound. Violence in South Carolina between Atlanta and Birmingham, a bus was burned outside of Anniston, Alabama. An organization by the name of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, dropped the Freedom Ride and a group of us decided that we must continue. From Nashville, 10 students, blacks and whites. Bull Connor, the police commissioner of Birmingham, stopped the bus at the Birmingham city limit, the Greyhound bus, arrest 2 young people, a young black man and a young white man, sitting on the front seat, and ordered the regular passengers to get off the bus in Birmingham. And he went around and looked at our tickets, and our tickets read from Nashville to Birmingham, Birmingham to Montgomery, Montgomery to Jackson, Jackson to New Orleans. And he made a decision in an hour and a half or so to place us all in jail in protective custody. And then 11 other students came from Nashville, as John Doar and John Seigenthaler would tell you. And on a Friday evening, after being in jail that Wednesday night, that Thursday night, that early Friday morning, Bull Connor took us to the Alabama-Tennessee state line and dropped us off and said, you can make it back to Nashville the best way you can. That was Klan territory. But we went back to Birmingham. And we tried to board a bus that Friday evening, like 5 p.m., and the bus driver made this classic statement. He said, I have only one life to give. I'm not going to give it to CORE or to the NAACP. And he refused to drive. And I think the Attorney General was very concerned that we were stuck in Birmingham that evening, but we stayed in that Greyhound bus station all that evening, all night. And he started negotiating with the local officials. At one time, he became so upset that he was heard to say, let me speak to Mr. Greyhound. And he wanted to know whether there was any black bus drivers in Birmingham that would take us from Birmingham on to Montgomery. And it was that evening, apparently sometime during that night, and you guys was in the Department of Justice, and you know, he negotiated where we would leave Birmingham that Saturday morning at 8:30 and arrived in Montgomery about 10:15 or 10:30. And made an arrangement where there would be a car, state patrol car, every 15 miles, and then there'd be a private plane flying over the bus. And the moment we arrived at the Greyhound bus station in Montgomery and started down the steps, an angry mob came out from nowhere, beating members of the press, reporters, photographers, and then they turned on us and started beating us. This young man was there. The public safety director of Alabama, a man by the name of Floyd Mann, while some of us were bloody, laying on the street, fired a gun straight in the air and said, there would be no killing here today, there'll be no killing here today, and the mob dispersed. On the next day, we had a mass meeting at Reverend Ralph Abernathy's church, the First Baptist Church in downtown Montgomery. Church full, not a single seat. And John Doar and others tried to interview us before the Alabama people, and we were disguised as members of the choir. I had been hit in the head, and I had a little patch on my head, and they placed a little cap on my head. And people started, members of the mob started marching on the church, throwing stink bombs, and apparently trying to burn down the church. And Dr. King went down into the basement of the church and made a call to Robert Kennedy and said, we need help here. And apparently the Attorney General spoke to his brother, the president, sent in the federal marshals, and I believe the Alabama National Guards were federalized. And if it hadn't been for Robert Kennedy, President Kennedy, I'm convinced that some of us would have died in that church that evening. Robert Kennedy used his power, used his ability to save lives that evening in Montgomery And I want to thank John Seigenthaler and John Doar for all they did to help. Thank you.
I thank you. Thank you so much, John, Mr. Attorney General, Ethel, Kathleen, friends of Robert Kennedy, friends of his legacy. How moving it is to be here today. I don't think I can walk into this building without thinking back on the first time I came here, and it was before the swearing in that we witnessed on tape a moment ago. It was shortly after the President and Bob had talked about, finally, his becoming Attorney General of the United States, and Attorney General Bill Rogers, who was his predecessor and his friend, offered him a suite of offices, and he came over first week in December. Angie Novello, we lost her just a few days ago, as we did Sarge, and I came with him, and the Attorney General came down with regularity to help make the transition easy. And there had been criticism of the President's appointment of Robert Kennedy as Attorney General. The media echoed words like nepotism. There were members of the conservative bar who questioned whether someone who had not been a courtroom attorney, for all he'd done as a government attorney, was really qualified to take the job on. And he was cognizant of that. I remember on the day General Rogers left, he gave Bob a present, two presents. Congress was about to pass a new law authorizing more than 100 new federal judges. And so Bill Rogers left Bob a bottle of aspirin and a fountain pen to sign all those recommendations to the President. I think his first concern was surrounding himself with people whose talent and ability in the professional law were admired both inside and outside the bar. On the night after he and the President talked finally about his becoming Attorney General, his first call, as I'm sure Ethel remembers, was to Byron White. And with Byron and Marion on the phone, Byron, who already had been mentioned as Secretary of the Army, he invited him to become Deputy Attorney General, and Byron said, "Bobby, I think you're going to be where the action is, and that's where I want to be." And I think of the talented lawyers who then came to surround him. Byron and Sarge Shriver both contributed to that recruiting. Byron relied heavily on lawyers he had known through his work through the American Bar Association, and relied heavily on former Yaleys. Burke Marshall came from an antitrust firm to head the Civil Rights Division and had the great good judgment to keep John Doar there, who had broken ground in voting rights cases in the South. Nick Katzenbach came in as head of the Office of Legal Counsel. Jack Miller headed the criminal division, distinguished lawyer. Some of you may remember later represented President Nixon in his troubles. Archibald Cox was Solicitor General, agreed to come down from Harvard and sort of balance the Yale contingent. Ramsey Clark headed the Lands Division. It was an exciting time for Ed Guthman, who handled press, and for Jack, and for me, and I know for John. It was a moment to be in the company of people who meant so much to the law. Lou Oberdorfer headed the tax division, went on to become a distinguished judge here in the district. Bill Orrick headed civil division, later a distinguished judge in the Ninth Circuit. It was an exciting experience to come to lunch, to come to work every day, and to go to lunch once every 3 or 4 weeks with that talented circle, and to listen to the work of justice unfold by these giants of justice. I think back on those days, and of course, John is right. The first crisis was the civil rights crisis in Montgomery. It was that moment with the freedom rides. I'm so happy to be part of this panel because my work in the Justice Department intersected with John that day when he almost died. What he did not say is that had Floyd Mann not fired that pistol that day, both John Lewis and Jim Zwerg might have lost their lives. I remember so well, Charleyne, his first speech as Attorney General. At the University of Georgia, a young man, senior in law school, came Jay Cox. Invited him to come make the Law Day speech, and Robert Kennedy said, "Young man, you know, if you ask me to come, I'll speak on civil rights. You may not get what you wish." And I remember so well, Jay Cox had done his research. And he said, "Mr. Attorney General, I remember reading that when you were a senior at the University of Virginia Law School, you invited Ralph Bunch to appear at the University of Virginia for Law Day. And there was an uproar. And the president of the university said he could not come. And your classmates wouldn't support you, but you pushed it. And Ambassador Bunch said, "I cannot come and will not come to speak before a segregated audience." And I remember, Mr. Attorney General, he did come, and somehow you integrated that audience. And so we went to Georgia, where I laid eyes for the first time on Charleyne Hunter-Gault. And the University of Georgia, the president from Athens called and first tried to discourage the visit, and then tried to discourage any possibility that he would have any encounter with Charleyne Hunter, because she had entered that university, been rejected the first time. Court of Appeals said, "You must take her and Hamilton Holmes." Both times their lives were at serious risk. And of course, he went, and of course he met with her. I think back on those days and what a great experience it was for me as a young journalist to simply be a part of the vitality the vision, the energy, of the daring that it was to cross, and it's not a cliche to cross that new frontier with him. And I think back on it and how often I remember his words, how often they echo and re-echo in my mind as crises occur, how often I think his words were almost prophetic. I relate meaningfully to what Peter Edlund said in that tape we watched a moment ago. We're not through yet. You know, the movement was about nonviolence. Nonviolence in a violent society. You can only think of a few days ago in Arizona, be reminded again the impact, the power, the passion of those words he uttered again and again. Let us tame the savageness of man. Let us make gentle the life of the world. Thank you very much.
I wish I'd gone first. Attorney General Holder, Kennedy and Malone families, members of this audience and fellow panelists, it's a real honor for me to be here. Although I don't think I needed the Attorney General to remind me that he was 5 years old 50 years ago. I was 19. I'm not good at math, but some of you have figured it out by now. I was 19 years old, and on January 9th, I walked onto the campus of the University of Georgia as its first female black student to a riotous crowd of white students shouting racial epithets and indeed calling for the crowd to kill me and Hamilton Holmes, my colleague who had entered the university with me. 4 months later, I heard about Law Day, and I thought about it with a certain irony, because despite the gentleman John just spoke about, the law students were among the organizers of the riot outside of my dormitory that led to windows to my room being broken and ultimately to my suspension, quote unquote, for my own safety, although we were returned within a few days. So I approached this day with a certain anticipation, a certain concern, and also I think I was encouraged because so many of the Georgia officials were refusing to come. I wasn't encouraged by that, but I was encouraged by the reason they were giving for not coming, which was they were afraid that Robert Kennedy was going to deliver a bombshell on civil rights. And indeed, none of the top officials of the state came to hear Robert Kennedy that day. And Griffin Bell, who was later to become assistant to Jimmy Carter, I believe it was, Attorney General, was to introduce Robert Kennedy, and at the last minute got cold feet. So someone else had to introduce him. So it was a room like this, a little bit bigger maybe, and I got there early so I could get a good seat. And my anticipation turned to anxiety as Robert Kennedy heaped praise on some of Georgia's arch segregationists, including Governor Vandiver, who, as my application was wending its way through the courts, had said, no, not one black student will ever attend the University of Georgia. So I sat there wondering, where was this going? You know, because he's saying, you know, he appreciated all, and he named all of these art segregationists, and I actually became uneasy. And at a certain point, I relaxed a little bit more and laughed when Kennedy spoke about being advised by Georgians to identify with some Georgia kinfolk. That always would get you over. He said, now, I've looked around and we don't have any Kennedys in Georgia, but in point of fact, Georgia had given his brother, he said, the largest, biggest percentage majority of any state in the Union, and he said that was better than kinfolk. So, you know, there was a little bit of a laughter, but still not everybody was sort of tense. And at that point, I was thinking about how the margin that he got was probably due in great part to the number of black people who were won over to the Kennedys when John Kennedy called Coretta King, when Martin Luther King was taken to Reedsville Prison on a trumped-up charge, and he called to find out if she was okay, and then quietly worked with his brother to speak to the judge to get Martin Luther King out of the prison. So when he said that, I thought, okay, that helps a little bit, my anxiety. But my anxieties really soon gave way to, as Kennedy started to talk about the law and about how when one man's rights are denied, the rights of all are endangered. And I thought, oh, this is going to get interesting, because people started shuffling in the room. And again, you know, this was not the most receptive crowd, even though it was a full house. And I knew then that the reason for the boycott of Robert Kennedy's speech was justified, because he was indeed about to drop a bombshell aimed at exploding the resistance that still continued throughout the South to the law of the land. I wrote about it, and as I recalled in the book at the time, I said he started out by saying that Southerners have a respect for candor and plain talk. They certainly don't like hypocrisy. And then I wrote, he proceeded to lay some candor and plain talk on them, including tying the struggle for freedom and justice and liberty at home to that of 50% of countries in the United Nations that were not white. And then, as far as I was concerned, what came next was the coup de grace for the whole day. As I was thinking in my mind that this was a hell of a speech, I suddenly heard Kennedy say, in the worldwide struggle, the graduation of Charleyne Hunter and Hamilton Holmes will without question aid and assist the fight against communism, political infiltration, and guerrilla warfare. And I gulped. I said, my graduation is going to do what? And then I said, I don't care how many people storm that stage when Robert Kennedy finishes speaking, I'm going to be up there with them. 2 weeks ago, I spoke at the 50th anniversary of the University of Georgia's desegregation. And I said at the time that I was there because good people did the right thing, that I've had the life that I have had. You know, when I was a young girl, I wanted to be Brenda Starr, be like Brenda Starr. And I said, nowadays, Brenda Starr could eat her heart out. I have had an amazing life as a journalist and as a human being. And they were good people, like our lawyers who pressed our case, good people like the judge on the federal bench who affirmed it and ordered our admission, and good people like Robert F. Kennedy who believed that the law is the glue that holds our civilization together, and that every day must be law day or our civilization will collapse. That's what he told us that day. But on that day, 50 years ago, Robert F. Kennedy also talked about the dearth of black faces in the federal government, most especially in the Justice Department. How proud he would be today to see the man at the helm of this institution who is there by virtue of his abilities, but is also unashamedly Black. And while there is no way I could divine what RFK would be saying about our society today, based on his committed words back then, I would wager an educated guess that he would be unhappy about the schools that are resegregated and failing our Black and minority children, and the downward spiral that leads particularly to the disproportionate number of Black men in prison, many there for nonviolent and first offenses, but who have drawn sentences far greater than their white counterparts guilty of the same crimes. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow tells the stark tale in irrefutable relief. And I would hope that RFK would not embrace the false claim of a post-racial society. There is nothing post-racial about these statistics and many others that I don't have time to articulate at this forum. But I would also hope that those who celebrate Robert F. Kennedy on this day would also elevate his message, the message that each of you has emphasized today, including the words from the Attorney General earlier, the words we've heard from Robert Kennedy himself, because it is a message that is timeless and transcendent, and it is a message that urges us to keep on keeping on. Thank you.
Mr. Attorney General, Mrs. Kennedy, Kathleen, everyone here, I'm honored to be asked to speak on behalf of the lawyers in the Civil Rights Division who served under Robert Kennedy, 1961 to 1963. I'm thinking particularly of Burke Marshall, Harold Green, David Norman, and Bob Owen, none of whom are present here today and can't be here. But all of us in the division, I think I can speak for them. I first met Robert Kennedy on the second or third day after President Kennedy was inaugurated. John Seigenthaler had prepared the Attorney General for a visit to my office in the first floor of the Justice Department. And he'd asked for some information as about what the division was doing. There was a Black farmer from East Carroll Parish, Louisiana, named Francis Joseph Atlas. He was an independent farmer, had about 100 acres of land on which he grew cotton and soybeans. He had 8 children or 9 children. He and his wife had educated all of them. They all had gone off to various places in the United States to work. And in November or December 1960, the Civil Rights Commission had held a hearing in New Orleans and asked him to come down and testify about the fact that there were no Black citizens of East Carroll Parish that could register to vote, because in order to be registered, you'd had to have a voucher of a registered official, and no white person would vouch for a Black man or woman. The Civil Rights Division investigated that case and filed a lawsuit on the 19th day of January, 1961. And Robert Kennedy came to my office. This was before any of his assistant attorney generals had been appointed or been sworn in, but he was there to find out what was going on in the division. I told him about this case, and he said, well, you picked a bad place to start. I said, well, that's where Atlas gins his cotton, or grows his cotton. And he had come back from this testimony in New Orleans and had been met at at his front door by the sheriff, and the sheriff said, don't bring your cotton to the ginners in East Carroll Parish. Why not, said Francis Joseph Atlas. The sheriff said, civil rights. As I say, we brought a suit to compel the ginners of that county, that parish, to register the cotton, to gin the cotton. And this was the first matter that came to Robert Kennedy's desk after he became Attorney General. For the next week or so, he devoted a good part of his time to trying to persuade the ginners of East Carroll Parish to gin that cotton. He was successful after about a week, and he said that the ginners will gin the cotton, and I said, we've got to have an injunction. We've got to be sure that there won't be any subsequent boycotts or efforts to drive Francis Joseph Atlas out of the parish. We talked back and forth about it. He called Frank Ellis, I think, and worked out an arrangement whereby all of the ginners of East Carroll Parish would appear before Judge Dawkins in Monroe, Louisiana, and on the record would tell the judge that they would gin Francis Joseph Atlas's cotton, and they would not deprive him of these goods and services that he needed to continue to run his farm. Now, all of that was done by the 3rd of February. I know that because to be sure that this was going to work out the way he said it was going to work out, he sent me down there to appear in court before Judge Dawkins and to hear the ginners of that parish tell the judge that they would gin Francis Joseph Atlas cotton. Think of it. The Attorney General from the first day put his mind and his effort and his energy and his drive just to help one cotton farmer in East Carroll Parish gin his cotton. That was a good omen for the country, believe me. It really was. And so in that first year, I saw an awful lot of Robert Kennedy. And I can remember his words. You've got to do more. What are you going to do about Mississippi? That's not good enough. I want suits in every parish, in every county in Mississippi and Alabama, and every parish in Louisiana. And so we started. And first there was Macon County, Alabama, and then we filed just about at the time of the Freedom Rides, the first case under the Kennedy administration in Dallas County, Selma, Alabama. Then in July, 2 cases were filed in Mississippi, and at the same time, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's Robert Moses wrote Burke Marshall, wrote the Attorney General, I think, and said that SNCC is going to work on voter registration in Mississippi. And that put in another burden on Robert Kennedy to see that the law was going to be enforced. All through those months in 1961, there were cases filed in Clark County, Mississippi, and Forest County, Mississippi, Ouachita, Louisiana, July 15th, Walthall County, Mississippi, August 3rd, Jefferson Davis County, August 4th, Montgomery, Alabama, August 4th, Plaquemine Parish, October 16th, Panola, Mississippi, October 16th, Madison Parish, Louisiana, Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, and then before the end of the year, the great case, U.S. versus Louisiana, and then shortly after the beginning of '62, the other great case, U.S. versus Mississippi. Those were remarkable times. And I've been asked to what I remember best about Robert Kennedy. Well, I remember his drive, his ability to get attorneys to work for him, his generosity, and his sense of humor. I've been asked, what do you think was his legacy? Now hear this. Robert Kennedy's legacy was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I've been asked why do I think he stood so strong for civil rights. I think the words of Burke Marshall best expressed it when he said, Robert Kennedy was such a strong advocate for the public accommodations, the lunch counter section of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Burke said, I know Bob Kennedy always thought, I know it without a glimmer of a doubt, that just because of the trust, the need to keep the black kids, the black students, to believe in their government, we had to support them on this issue of public accommodations. At least it was the morally thing to do. That was the Robert Kennedy I remember.
I wonder if we could change the pace a little, and let me ask John Seigenthaler, what was it like to go visit Hickory Hill?
What was it like to go visit Hickory Hill? It was, it began with chaos. No, it was a wonderful experience to visit Hickory Hill. I'd look at his 6 children who are here today, and you couldn't go to Hickory Hill and have dinner without seeing those angelic faces, beaming, smiling, sometimes tearful faces, without hearing Ethel lead them in their night prayers, without seeing Bob roughhouse with them on the rug. There was something called the Hickory Hill Seminars. Leading lights of the administration came to Hickory Hill to conduct those seminars, bringing their own expertise from their own backgrounds to share with other members of the administration. It was Bob's vision that these seminars would bring the administration and those who were leading it together in interaction that would promote cooperation and understanding throughout that administration. To go to Hickory Hill for whatever reason, and there were some tough decisions made there, was always for me a sheer joy. It was an exciting experience. And so many memories reside there. And I think to understand the fullness of his humanity, you needed to see him at home with Ethel, who knew him best and loved him most, and with those children who are indeed the most vital segment of his legacy.
John Doar, I wonder if we could recall a little bit the night of Ole Miss. I remember I was in Washington in the department. The Attorney General was at the White House during that. It's one of the worst nights of my life, and I was just a spectator. There's so much danger, so much threat, so much violence that about 4 o'clock in the morning, the Attorney General's phone rang, and there was nobody else there to answer it, so I answered it, and it was the President. And he said, "Is my brother there?" And I said, "No, he's on his way to the White House." He said, "Well, in that case, I'm free to ask you, how's he doing?" John, could you talk about that night from your perspective?
Well, several weeks before, I was working on a voter registration case in Forest County, Mississippi. It was a contempt case against the registrar, and there was a very peculiar three-judge court judging that case. The three judges were three judges of the Court of Appeals: Judge John Minor Wisdom, Judge Brown from Texas, and Judge Bell from Georgia. And during that time, James Meredith was pushing to get into university in the state of Mississippi. One way or another, were trying to keep him out. And he'd been rejected by Governor Barnett for the first time. And the Attorney General said to me, he said, "I think if you go to Louisiana with New Orleans with Jim McShane and get James Meredith, I think that they will register Meredith at the office of the University of Mississippi in Jackson." So we went there, and there was a crowd around the office building, and we went up to the 7th floor of the state office building, and when we got to the door to the University of Mississippi's office, the door opened, and there stood the Honorable Ross Barnett. And at that time, the television lights went on behind me, and Governor Barnett looked at me, and then he looked at James McShane with the map of Ireland on his face, and then he looked at James Meredith, and he said, "Which one of you is James Meredith?" Well, we got turned back there, so then we went to Memphis, and there was maneuvering back and forth about getting us into the university. And we went halfway down to Jackson one day, and it said it wasn't safe to go back, turn back. Finally, on a Sunday afternoon, it was worked out that we could enter the university, and very suitable quarters, secure quarters, were provided for James Meredith about 200 yards behind the Lyceum building, where all the trouble started. And it began as a kind of a rally after a football game with the students jeering the marshals who had surrounded parts of the Lyceum building. And but as it got dark, it got awfully mean, and there was real trouble. It was very, very fortunate that it turned out as it did, because it could have turned out much worse. But anyway, the next morning, James Meredith was registered, and he started his class. He continued going to his classes, and he graduated from the University of Mississippi. Now, 6 months before that happened, I sat with an attorney in the Justice Department, Civil Rights Division in Burke Marshall, and that attorney expressed doubt that James Meredith would enter the university that fall. He was sure that there'd be some deal made that Meredith would not enter the university. And Burke said to him, "There's not going to be any doubt about it. He is going to go to the university, and he's going to be able to stay in the university, and if he wants to, he's going to be able to graduate from the university. Now, he was speaking for Robert Kennedy, and that's what happened.
Congressman, John mentioned rightly the Voting Rights Act of 1965. One could say that was the ultimate achievement of the department. As Burke once wrote, only political power, not court orders or other federal law, will ensure the election of fair men as sheriffs, school board members, police chiefs, mayors, county commissioners, and state officials. Think of those words, fair men. You're a wonderful example of what happened because of the Voting Rights Act. Could you talk some about its effect, to your knowledge, in the South?
Well, without the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we wouldn't be living in the society that we're living in today. The Voting Rights Act of 65 transformed not just the American South, but it transformed our nation. Just think, just a few short years ago, John Doar, John Seigenthaler, Charleyne Hunter-Gault would tell you, and the lawyers that worked in the Department of Justice, that hundreds and thousands of people stood in unmovable line. John, on one occasion, a man was asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. Yeah. On another occasion, a man was asked to count the number of jelly beans in a jar. There was one county in Alabama, Lowndes County, between Selma and Montgomery. The county was more than 80% African American. There was not a single registered African American voter in the county. You had to be able to interpret some section of the Constitution of the state. And people's homes was bombed, and people were beaten, shot, killed, evicted from their farms and their plantation. So the Voting Rights Act transformed not just the South, but all of us. Bobby Kennedy said on one occasion, I think during the campaign, and I think this is what happened. He would be very proud to see what has happened. He said on one occasion, there must be a revolution. Not a revolution in the streets, not a revolution of violence, but a revolution of values and a revolution of ideas. And that's what has happened in the American South. I've said over and over again, without the Voting Rights Act of 65, without the bridge in Selma, there would be no Barack Obama as President of the United States of America.
Charleyne, the Congressman just mentioned changing the spirit of the South. Could you tell us about the legacy of Robert Kennedy's contributions as they affected the world, from, for example, in South Africa?
Well, I think, he began even then in the May that he came to the University of Georgia to talk about the importance of the emerging nations of the world and how our own destiny was linked to that. And I think this was the first time that a lot of those people in that room had ever heard anything like that. But he had foresight to see where things were going, and he laid it out that day. And he talked about the countries where, like South Africa, where people were still under the awful racist system of apartheid. And I think that his vision was about, as he said so often in so many of the speeches of his that I've read, including that Law Day speech, his vision was about not only an American society that where justice and freedom and equality were values that everybody embraced, but a world society that embraced those values. And I think that's where he was headed. I think that's where Martin Luther King was headed, to talk about how the interconnection between the justice here and the justice elsewhere. And I think that's something we still grapple with today. But as I said earlier, his values, the values that he articulated, were values that, you know, I don't know that many people come along in a lifetime whose values are so timeless and transcendent. Martin Luther King was one. We listened yesterday to John F. Kennedy's. I still quote him at graduation speeches, ask not, you know, and it's still relevant to our society today. So he was visionary in his thinking, not only about our own society, but how we fit into the larger global community.
It's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you to the panel for an extraordinary presentation.